My father hired men to kidnap me on my morning jog. How did I escape a kidnapping? I didn't. I just survived long enough to find out my own father ordered it. I was on my usual 6 a.m. jog when a white van pulled up beside me. The door slid open and hands yanked me inside before I could scream. 2 men in the back, a driver up front, my feet leaving the ground. I fought like I was dying. Bit one man's hand until I tasted blood. Kicked the other in the face, felt his nose crack. Slammed a head against the metal floor. Found a crowbar and swung it at anything that moved. "We're taking you somewhere remote," one said through bloody teeth. "Easy or hard, you're coming with us." I made it hard. I climbed toward the front, reached through the partition, threw the driver's hot coffee in his face, grabbed the wheel, yanked it hard to the right. The van flipped twice, metal crunching, glass shattering, bodies thrown like rag dolls. When it stopped, I was pressed against the roof, bleeding from a dozen cuts, my shoulder dislocated, 3 ribs cracked. I later learned the impact had bruised my kidney, but I crawled out through the burst back doors. Stood on the highway surrounded by stopped cars and staring strangers. One of the men climbed out behind me, looked at his unconscious partners, and ran before the sirens arrived. 3 weeks in the hospital, 2 surgeries, months of physical therapy. The police caught one of the kidnappers 2 weeks later. He gave up everything in exchange for a plea deal. They'd been hired through an intermediary, cash payment, instructions to take me to an abandoned property outside the city. Someone would meet them there. They didn't know what would happen after. The intermediary was traced through phone records. My Uncle Frank, my father's brother. I thought there'd been a mistake. Uncle Frank had bounced me on his knee as a baby. He'd taught me to ride a bike. He'd walked me down the aisle at my first communion when Dad was working. But Uncle Frank confessed too, once they found the money trail. My father had paid him $50,000 to arrange my kidnapping. The plan was to hold me for ransom, let my mother pay. They were divorced, she was wealthy, and split the money. If the ransom didn't come, I was supposed to disappear. My father sat across from me in the police station, handcuffed, and tried to explain. "Your mother turned you against me in the divorce. I lost everything. The house, the business, my retirement. She poisoned you kids against me, and then she got to keep living like a queen while I had nothing. So you tried to have me kidnapped." I was desperate. I just needed the money. I wasn't going to let them hurt you. Dad, I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. I had internal bleeding. I almost died in that van. That wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to go quietly. They said they wouldn't hurt you. He was more upset that I'd fought back than that he'd ordered my kidnapping. My mother flew in from California. She held me in the hospital and cried. She said she'd always known Dad was dangerous. Said she'd tried to warn me. Said she'd wanted to tell me years ago but was afraid I'd hate her. My brother Derek called from overseas. He said he'd suspected something was wrong with Dad for years. Said there were signs. Said he wished he'd said something sooner. Everyone knew. Everyone suspected. Nobody told me. I'd had dinner with my father 2 weeks before the kidnapping. He'd asked about my jogging route, what time I left, whether I ran alone. I'd thought he was taking an interest in my life. He was planning where to grab me. The trial is in 4 months. My therapist says I have complex PTSD. I can't jog anymore. Panic attack the one time I tried. I sleep with a knife under my pillow. I check the locks obsessively. Every white van makes my heart stop. My father writes me letters from jail. He says he's sorry. He says he was mentally unwell. He says I should testify about his good character, about the loving father he used to be, about how the divorce broke him. His lawyer contacted my lawyer asking if I'd support a diminished capacity defense. My brother thinks I should. "He's still our dad," Derek said. "He made a mistake." A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is saying something hurtful. Hiring men to kidnap your daughter and potentially kill her if the ransom doesn't come? That's not a mistake. I told the prosecutor I'd testify for the state. Derek hasn't spoken to me since. Mom says I'm being too hard on everyone. That I need to find forgiveness to heal. That holding on to anger only hurts myself. But every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that van. Fighting for my life. Not knowing that the person who put me there was the man who taught me to ride a bike. Some things you don't forgive. Some things you just survive. The prosecutor's office sat 3 blocks from the courthouse in a building that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. I walked through the security checkpoint, signed in at the front desk, and took the elevator to the 4th floor, where a receptionist directed me to a small conference room with a view of the parking lot. Layla Harrington arrived 5 minutes later carrying a thick folder and 2 bottles of water. She wore a navy suit and practical flats, her dark hair pulled back in a bun, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and steady. She set the folder on the table between us and opened it to reveal police reports, medical records, and photographs I recognized from the hospital. She explained that testifying would mean walking through every detail of the kidnapping in front of a jury, answering questions from both her and the defense attorney, and facing my father across the courtroom while I did it. Her voice stayed calm and professional as she described how defense attorneys in family cases typically attack victim credibility, suggesting the daughter is lying because she's angry about the divorce or wants attention or has been manipulated by the other parent. She said Nelson Contreras would probably try all three approaches, and that my job would be to stay calm and stick to the facts, no matter how he tried to rattle me. I asked if she thought the jury would believe me, and she said the physical evidence was strong, but that my testimony would make the difference between a conviction and reasonable doubt. She walked me through the timeline we'd present, starting with my father asking about my jogging route over dinner, and ending with Uncle Frank's confession about the contingency plan if the ransom didn't come. When she said contingency plan out loud, my hands started shaking and she pushed one of the water bottles toward me without commenting on it. Layla left the room and returned with a man who introduced himself as Philip Harrington, her colleague who worked with crime victims preparing for trial. He had kind eyes and spoke quietly, explaining that his job was to help me get ready for cross-examination, so nothing Nelson said would catch me off guard. He opened a notebook and showed me a list of questions the defense would likely ask, things like whether I had a good relationship with my father before the divorce, whether my mother ever said negative things about him, whether I benefited financially from testifying against him. He said Nelson would try to paint me as an angry daughter exaggerating events because I sided with my mother and wanted revenge for the divorce. Philip explained that the best defense against these tactics was short, factual answers that didn't give the attorney room to twist my words or make me seem emotional and unstable. We practiced for an hour, him asking hostile questions in a gentle voice while I learned to breathe through the anger and respond with simple facts. By the end, I felt slightly less terrified about facing my father's lawyer, though Philip warned me that the real thing would be harder because Nelson would use a tone designed to make me defensive or upset. 3 days later, I sat in Cade Wolf's therapy office for my first session since deciding to testify. The office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, and a white noise machine by the door that made me feel like I was underwater. Cade asked how I was handling the decision to testify, and I said I felt good about it, which was true. Then he asked how I felt about my brother and mother wanting me to minimize what happened, and something in my chest got tight and hot. I heard myself saying I was angrier at them than at my father, which didn't make sense until I said it out loud. My father was a monster, but at least he was honest about what he'd done. Derek and Mom were asking me to protect someone who'd tried to have me killed, wrapping it in language about forgiveness and family and healing, when really they just wanted me to make their lives easier. Cade asked what it meant to me that they were prioritizing my father's comfort over my safety, and I realized I'd been trying not to think about that question for weeks. He said trauma reveals people's true character, shows you who someone really is when the stakes are high, and that Derek choosing Dad over my safety told me everything I needed to know about his values. I left the session feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, like I'd named something that had been sitting on my chest without permission. Derek called that night while I was making dinner. His voice came through the phone sharp and angry, none of the careful distance from our last conversation. He said I was destroying what was left of our family by testifying for the prosecution, that Dad's lawyer had told him my testimony could add 10 years to the sentence, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I put down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables and asked him if he understood what Dad had done. He said of course he understood, but that Dad was mentally unwell and desperate and I was choosing to punish him instead of showing compassion. I asked Derek if he'd read the police reports, if he knew about the contingency plan, if he understood that I was supposed to disappear if Mom didn't pay the ransom. He said accidents happen, that Dad never meant for me to get hurt, that I was making it worse by fighting back. Something in me went cold and quiet. I told Derek that Dad destroyed our family when he hired men to kidnap me, not when I decided to tell the truth about it under oath. I said I wouldn't lie to protect someone who'd tried to have me killed just because we shared DNA. I told him the family he thought I was destroying had never actually existed, that it was built on Mom's silence and everyone pretending Dad wasn't dangerous, and that I was done performing that lie. Derek said I was being selfish and dramatic, that I always made everything about me, that I was going to regret this when Dad died in prison, and I had to live with that guilt. I said I'd rather live with that than live with lying, and then I hung up before he could respond. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, staring at the half-chopped vegetables, and I knew that was probably the last real conversation my brother and I would ever have. The next session with Cade focused on losing Derek. I told him about the phone call and how Derek had said I was being selfish, and Cade asked if I believed that. I said no, but that it still hurt to have my brother choose Dad over me after everything that happened. Cade said grief wasn't just about death, that I was grieving the brother I thought I had, the one who would have supported me instead of defending the person who'd orchestrated my kidnapping. He said Derek had shown me who he really was, and that believing him was an act of clarity, not cruelty. We talked about how trauma reveals character, how some people rise to meet the moment while others protect themselves by minimizing what happened to you. Derek couldn't face the reality of what Dad had done, so he'd decided I was the problem instead. Cade said that told me everything I needed to know about whether Derek was someone I could trust with my safety or my truth. I left feeling sad but also certain, like I'd lost something that had already been gone for a while. My mother flew back into town 2 weeks later and texted asking if we could have lunch. We met at a restaurant downtown, one of those places with exposed brick and expensive salads, and she hugged me like everything was normal. We ordered food and made small talk about her flight and my apartment and the weather, and then she said she'd been thinking about the trial. She suggested I could testify about Dad's good qualities while still being honest about what happened, talk about how he used to coach my soccer team, and come to my school events, help the jury see him as a whole person who made a terrible mistake. I set down my fork and looked at her carefully. I asked if she understood that Dad had hired people to kidnap me and potentially kill me if the ransom didn't come. She said of course she understood, but that he was still my father and that showing compassion might help me heal. I realized she was trying to have it both ways, supporting me publicly while privately hoping I'd soften the impact, so she didn't have to feel guilty about her choices. She wanted me to perform forgiveness, so she could stop feeling bad about staying quiet all those years when she knew he was dangerous. I told my mother directly that I wouldn't be doing emotional labor to make Dad's consequences easier for everyone else to digest. I said his good qualities didn't cancel out hiring kidnappers. That being a good soccer coach didn't mean he deserved leniency for trying to have his daughter killed for money. I told her I was going to testify about exactly what happened without sugarcoating it to protect people's feelings, and that if she wanted to support me, she needed to accept that. She looked hurt, her eyes getting wet, but she didn't argue. She just nodded and changed the subject to her garden back in California. We finished lunch making careful conversation about nothing important, and when we hugged goodbye, it felt like a small victory that I'd held my boundary even when she tried to guilt me into breaking it. Layla called a few days later with an update about the trial. She said Ridge McCarty, the kidnapper who'd cooperated, would testify about the specific instructions he'd received from Uncle Frank. He'd tell the jury about being hired to grab me during my morning jog, take me to an abandoned property outside the city, and wait for ransom payment. Then Layla said he'd also testify about the contingency plan if the ransom didn't come within 48 hours. Hearing contingency plan spelled out like that made my stomach drop, made the room tilt sideways for a second. I knew what contingency plan meant. It meant make the problem disappear. It meant kill me and dump my body somewhere it wouldn't be found. Layla's voice stayed professional and calm as she explained that this testimony would be crucial for proving my father's intent, that it showed premeditation and willingness to have me murdered if the money didn't come through. I thanked her and hung up and sat on my couch staring at nothing, trying to process that my father had actually planned for my death as a backup option. The Victim Impact Statement workshop met in a community center conference room with fluorescent lights and metal folding chairs. About 15 people sat in a circle while a facilitator explained that victim impact statements give us a voice in the sentencing process, a chance to tell the judge and jury how the crime affected our lives. She said the statements would be read at sentencing if the defendant was convicted, and that they could influence the judge's decision about the length of the sentence. She passed out worksheets with prompts about physical injuries, emotional trauma, financial costs, and changes to daily life. I looked at the blank lines and thought about panic attacks in parking lots, about not being able to jog without flashbacks, about sleeping with a knife under my pillow, about checking locks 5 times before I could relax. I thought about losing my brother and having to set boundaries with my mother, and learning that everyone in my family had suspected Dad was dangerous, but nobody had warned me. The facilitator said to be specific and honest, to help the court understand the full scope of harm, and I started writing knowing I had months of damage to catalog. I wrote each line carefully, cataloging the panic attacks that hit me in parking lots when white vans pulled up beside me. I described how I couldn't exercise outdoors anymore without my chest tightening and my vision narrowing. I explained the hypervigilance about locked doors, how I checked them 5 times before bed and still got up to check again at 2 in the morning. I detailed the nightmares where I was back in that van fighting for my life, waking up with my sheets soaked in sweat and my shoulder aching from phantom dislocations. The worksheet had lines for physical injuries, but not enough space for the ways my brain had rewired itself around fear. I filled 3 additional pages describing how I flinched at sudden movements, how I couldn't sit with my back to doors, how I planned escape routes in every building I entered. The facilitator walked around the room while we wrote, occasionally stopping to offer tissues or a supportive hand on someone's shoulder. When she reached my table, she glanced at my pages and nodded, understanding in her eyes that some crimes leave marks you can't photograph for evidence. 3 days later, I sat in Cade's office working on courtroom anxiety management. He asked me to describe what scared me most about facing my father during testimony, and I admitted it was the possibility of breaking down on the stand and proving everyone right who said I was too emotional to be credible. Cade handed me a small stone from his desk and told me to focus on its weight and texture when I felt panic rising, We practiced grounding techniques, counting 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. He made me repeat them until the sequence became automatic, until my breathing slowed and my hands stopped shaking. Then he said something that stuck with me, that feeling afraid didn't mean I was weak, it meant I was human, and that my father had earned my fear through his actions. We spent the rest of the session practicing testimony while I held the stone, learning to pause and breathe when questions got difficult instead of rushing through answers to make the discomfort end faster. Layla called the following week with news about Nelson's legal maneuvering. He'd filed a motion to exclude certain evidence, arguing that my father's financial desperation after the divorce should be considered mitigating context rather than motive. She explained that Nelson was trying to paint Dad as a victim of circumstances who made bad choices under extreme stress, hoping the judge would limit what the jury heard about his planning and intent. I asked if it would work, if the judge might actually buy that poverty justified hiring kidnappers, and Layla's laugh was sharp and bitter. She said the motion was denied within hours, that the judge wrote in his ruling that financial hardship might explain theft or fraud, but didn't excuse conspiracy to kidnap and potentially murder one's own child. Relief flooded through me so strongly I had to sit down, grateful that at least one person in authority wasn't going to let my father hide behind excuses about how hard his life had been since the divorce. My physical therapist cleared me for normal activities 2 weeks before the trial. She tested my range of motion, had me lift weights and do exercises that would have been impossible 5 months earlier when my shoulder was still healing. She said I'd made remarkable progress considering the severity of my injuries, but noted that I still favored my left side and probably always would. The muscles had healed, but the body remembered trauma, compensating in ways that became permanent habits. I asked if that meant I'd always have this reminder, this physical evidence of what happened, and she nodded with sympathy in her eyes. The permanence made me angry all over again, knowing that even if I worked through the PTSD and rebuilt my sense of safety, my body would carry the marks of his choices forever. I'd walk slightly uneven for the rest of my life because my father decided I was worth less than $50,000. A letter arrived from my father that was different from all the others. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope and almost threw it away unopened, but something made me look inside. This one didn't ask me to testify for his defense or talk about his good qualities or explain how the divorce had broken him. Instead, it said he understood if I hated him, and that he hated himself too. That he woke up every morning in his cell knowing what he'd done and wishing he could take it back. I read it twice, trying to figure out what he wanted from me, what response this confession was meant to trigger. But there was no request, no plea for forgiveness, just his self-pity laid out like an offering I was supposed to do something with. I filed it away in the folder with all his other letters without responding, because I didn't know what to do with his hatred of himself when I was still dealing with what his hatred of my mother had almost cost me. Layla and I met to review my testimony, spreading documents across her conference table showing the timeline of events and the evidence supporting each claim. She walked me through the morning of the kidnapping, the investigation that followed, the money trail connecting my father to Uncle Frank to the kidnappers. She showed me Ridge's testimony transcript and Uncle Frank's confession, the phone records and bank statements that proved premeditation. Then she warned me that Nelson would try to make me emotional on the stand, asking questions designed to upset me so I'd seem unstable or vindictive rather than credible. He'd probably ask about the divorce, about whether I sided with my mother, about any arguments I'd had with my father in the years before the kidnapping. He'd try to suggest I was exaggerating my injuries or my ongoing symptoms to make the crime seem worse than it was. Layla told me to stick to facts, to answer only what was asked without elaborating, and to remember that getting upset didn't make me a bad witness. It made me a person describing something terrible that actually happened. Philip coached me on staying calm during cross-examination, explaining that short factual answers were better than emotional explanations. We practiced with him asking hostile questions about my relationship with my father, about whether I'd refused his calls or visits, about whether I wanted him to go to prison because I blamed him for the divorce. I learned to pause before answering, to take a breath and hold the stone Cade had given me, to say only what was necessary without defending myself against accusations that weren't really questions. Philip played the role of Nelson Contreras, his voice taking on an edge of skepticism and judgment that made my shoulders tense. After an hour of practice, my voice stopped shaking when I answered, my responses becoming automatic and steady even when the questions felt like attacks. Philip said I was ready, that I'd done the hard work of preparing, and now I just had to trust that work when the actual moment came. I learned Uncle Frank had taken a plea deal 2 days before trial was scheduled to begin. Layla called to tell me he'd agreed to testify against my father in exchange for a reduced sentence, that his testimony about their planning conversations would be devastating for the defense. She explained that Uncle Frank would describe my father approaching him with the idea, offering him $50,000 to arrange everything, providing details about my jogging route and schedule. He'd testify about discussing the contingency plan if ransom wasn't paid, about my father saying the problem would need to disappear if my mother didn't come through with the money. Layla said this testimony proved premeditation beyond any doubt, showed that my father had thought through every step, including my potential death. I asked what Uncle Frank's reduced sentence would be, and she said probably 8 to 10 years instead of 15 to 20. It seemed like a small price for helping plan my kidnapping, but I understood why the prosecution needed his cooperation to prove the case against my father. My mother called to tell me that Dad's parents wanted to see me before the trial started. She said they were struggling with what their son had done, and hoped talking to me might help them understand or find some peace with the situation. I declined immediately, explaining that I couldn't provide them comfort about their son's choices when I was still dealing with the consequences of those choices. My mother tried to convince me it would be a kind gesture, that they were old and heartbroken and just wanted to see I was okay. I told her I understood they were suffering, but that wasn't my responsibility to fix, that I needed to focus on getting through testimony without taking on additional emotional labor for people who raised the man who tried to have me killed. She went quiet on the phone and then said she understood, her voice sad but accepting. After we hung up, I felt guilty for about 10 minutes before remembering that guilt was just another way people tried to make me responsible for my father's impact on the family. Kate and I discussed that guilt in our next session, working through why I felt bad about my grandparents suffering when I hadn't done anything wrong. He asked me who created the situation, who made the choice that led to all these ripple effects, and I said my father did. He asked me if I was responsible for my father's actions, and I said no. Then he asked why I was carrying guilt that belonged to someone else, why I felt obligated to manage everyone's pain when I was still recovering from my own. I didn't have a good answer except that it felt wrong to let people hurt when I could maybe help, even if helping meant setting myself on fire to keep them warm. Cade said that was exactly the problem, that I'd been taught to prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being, and that my father had counted on that training when he planned my kidnapping. He'd assumed I'd go quietly, that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd cooperate to avoid making things difficult. The person who created this situation was the one who should carry the guilt for everyone's suffering, not the person who survived it. Layla called 2 weeks before the trial date. She said Nelson had reached out about a plea deal, that my father would admit guilt to smaller charges if it meant skipping the trial completely. She explained the offer carefully, making sure I understood the numbers and what they meant. She said the choice was mine to make, that the prosecutor's office would follow my lead on whether to accept or push forward to trial. I asked what the sentence difference would be, and she laid it out plainly. A plea deal might get him 12 years with good behavior, bringing that down to 8 or 9. Going to trial and winning could mean 20 years, maybe 18 with parole after 15. The gap felt enormous when she said the numbers out loud. I sat in my apartment after the call and tried to figure out what I actually wanted. Part of me thought 12 years sounded like justice, that watching him spend over a decade in prison would prove he faced consequences for what he did. Another part felt sick at the idea of lawyers bargaining my trauma down to a number that fit neatly into their schedules. I kept thinking about him sitting in that police station telling me I should have gone quietly, that my injuries were my own fault for fighting back. I thought about Uncle Frank getting 8 years for helping plan my possible murder. I thought about Ridge and the other kidnappers taking plea deals to avoid trials. Everyone was negotiating except me, and now they wanted me to join them in pretending this could be solved with paperwork and reduced charges. I called Cade and talked through the whole thing. He asked what I needed from the trial, what outcome would let me move forward. I told him I needed a jury to hear what happened and decide if it deserved the maximum penalty, not let lawyers trade my kidnapping down to something manageable. He asked if I was prepared for how hard testifying would be, and I said I'd been preparing for months. He reminded me that choosing the trial wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability, and I needed to be clear on which one I was seeking. I thought about that distinction for 2 days. Revenge would be wanting him to suffer the way I suffered, wanting him to feel every bit of pain and fear I felt in that van. Accountability was wanting the legal system to treat his actions as seriously as they deserved, to not let financial desperation excuse attempted murder. I called Layla back and told her I wanted to proceed to trial. She said she'd inform Nelson that we were declining the plea offer. 3 days later, she called again. Nelson had withdrawn the plea entirely and filed new motions arguing my father's mental state at the time of the kidnapping. He'd submitted psychological evaluations claiming my father had a breakdown after the divorce, that his judgment was impaired by depression and financial stress. Layla sounded annoyed but not surprised. She said this was predictable desperation since the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the plea option was gone. She said the judge would likely deny the motion since my father had been functional enough to plan the kidnapping methodically over several weeks. The motion got denied in less than 48 hours. Jury selection started on a Monday morning in a courthouse that smelled like floor cleaner and old wood. I sat behind Layla at the prosecution table and watched potential jurors file into the courtroom. Nelson questioned each one carefully, trying to find people who seemed sympathetic to financial hardship, or who looked uncomfortable with the idea of adult children testifying against parents. He asked about their relationships with their own kids, whether they'd been through divorces, how they felt about family loyalty. Layla systematically challenged anyone who seemed inclined to excuse his behavior. She focused on people who understood that family relationships didn't override criminal responsibility, who could separate loving someone from holding them accountable for their actions. The process took 2 full days. By Wednesday afternoon, the jury was seated. 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from early 30s to late 60s. I studied their faces from my seat and wondered which ones would decide my father's fate. I wondered if any of them had been through something similar, if they'd ever loved someone who hurt them badly enough that forgiveness felt impossible. I wondered if they'd understand that you could grieve someone who was still alive because the person you thought you knew never actually existed. Opening statements began Thursday morning. Layla stood in front of the jury and laid everything out in clear, calm terms. She described my usual jogging route and the white van that pulled up beside me. She described the fight inside the van, the crash, my injuries. She described the investigation that traced everything back to my father's bank accounts and Uncle Frank's phone records. She showed them the money transfers, the phone logs, the timeline of planning that proved this wasn't an impulsive decision. She told them about the instructions Ridge received, about the contingency plan if ransom didn't arrive, about the remote location where I was supposed to disappear if my mother didn't pay. Her voice never wavered, never got emotional. She just presented the facts and let them speak for themselves. Nelson's opening statement painted a completely different picture. He described my father as a good man destroyed by an unfair divorce, driven to desperate choices by financial ruin and alienation from his children. He talked about my father coaching my soccer team when I was young, attending every school event, being present and loving before my mother poisoned me against him. He suggested I was testifying from anger about the divorce rather than facts about the kidnapping, that I wanted to punish my father for losing the marriage. He said the prosecution would present evidence of poor decisions made during a mental health crisis, but that didn't make my father a monster. It made him a broken man who needed help, not decades in prison. I felt my hands shaking in my lap while he spoke. Ridge took the stand first that afternoon. He looked smaller in his prison uniform than I remembered from the van, older and tired. He described being hired through Uncle Frank to grab someone for ransom, said the instructions were specific and clear. Take me to a particular location outside the city, wait for payment, and if payment didn't come within 48 hours, make the problem disappear. He said those exact words while looking at the jury. Make the problem disappear. He described the plan falling apart when I fought back, when the van crashed, when his partners got hurt. He said he'd taken his plea deal months ago and had nothing to gain from lying now. Nelson stood up for cross-examination and tried to suggest Ridge was lying to reduce his own sentence further. Ridge looked at him calmly and explained he'd already received his reduced sentence, that his plea deal was finalized and testifying here didn't change his time. He said he was testifying because he'd been asked to and because telling the truth was part of his agreement. Nelson pushed harder, asking if Ridge had been promised anything for his testimony today. Ridge said no. Nelson asked if he felt pressured by prosecutors. Ridge said no. Nelson asked if he was certain about the instructions regarding what to do if ransom didn't arrive. Ridge looked directly at the jury and repeated the phrase, "Make the problem disappear." Those were the exact words he'd been given. Several jurors wrote notes while he spoke. I watched them and tried to read their expressions but couldn't tell what they were thinking. Uncle Frank took the stand next, wearing a suit that looked too big for him now. He'd lost weight since the arrest. Lost something else too. Maybe the part of him that could look people in the eye. He kept his head down while the bailiff swore him in, kept his hands folded in his lap like a kid waiting to be scolded. Layla walked him through the timeline. When did my father first approach him about the plan? What exactly did my father say? What was Uncle Frank's role supposed to be? He answered each question in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask him twice to speak up. My father called him 6 weeks before the kidnapping happened. Asked if Uncle Frank knew anyone who could handle a job. A delicate job, Dad had called it. Uncle Frank said he knew some guys from his construction days who weren't too careful about what work they took. Dad offered him $50,000 to make the arrangements. To provide my jogging schedule, my route, the best time to grab me. Uncle Frank's voice cracked when Layla asked why he agreed to help. He said he needed the money. His wife had left him. He was behind on child support. He was desperate. But then he stopped and shook his head. He said that wasn't really why. The truth was he'd always been jealous of my father, jealous of the life Dad had before the divorce. And when Dad came to him broken and angry, Uncle Frank saw a chance to be the one with power for once, to be the one Dad needed. Layla asked if he understood what might happen to me. Uncle Frank started crying then. Real crying, not the kind you can fake. He said he convinced himself it would be simple. Mom would pay the ransom fast. I'd be returned. Nobody would get hurt. He said he didn't let himself think about the contingency plan, about what would happen if the money didn't come. He just told himself it wouldn't come to that. Layla showed him the bank records. Transfers from my father's account to Uncle Frank's. Then from Uncle Frank's account to Ridge. Uncle Frank confirmed each one. Yes, that was the initial payment. Yes, that was the second half after they confirmed they had the location secured. Yes, that was the bonus Dad promised if everything went smoothly. Nothing went smoothly. I watched Nelson stand up for cross-examination, but he barely asked Uncle Frank anything. Just confirmed that Uncle Frank had already pleaded guilty, that he was testifying as part of his agreement with prosecutors, that he understood he was going to prison regardless of what happened to my father. Uncle Frank said yes to all of it. Nelson sat back down. Even he could see that Uncle Frank's breakdown made the whole conspiracy look worse, not better. Remorse didn't erase the planning. It just proved Uncle Frank knew exactly how wrong it was while he did it anyway. The detective took the stand after lunch. Detective Ramos, the one who'd traced everything back through the phone records and money transfers. She brought binders full of evidence, bank statements, phone logs, text messages between my father and Uncle Frank discussing the best time to make the grab, whether I ran with headphones, if I ever changed my route. She walked the jury through each piece methodically. This call on this date where they discussed payment. This text message where Dad confirmed my schedule. This bank transfer the day after they finalized the plan. She showed them the pattern of calls between Uncle Frank and Ridge, between Ridge and the other kidnappers, all traced back through cell tower records. She presented the timeline of payments. First installment 2 weeks before the kidnapping. Second payment the day before. The paper trail was perfect. Too perfect for this to be some impulsive decision made during a mental health crisis like Nelson wanted the jury to believe. This was planned, organized, funded, executed. The only thing that went wrong was me fighting back hard enough to crash the van. Detective Ramos testified about finding the abandoned property where they were supposed to take me. An old warehouse 40 minutes outside the city. No neighbors, no cameras, no witnesses. She showed photos of the location. Empty rooms, concrete floors. One chair bolted to the ground in the center of the main space. The jury looked at those photos for a long time. Nelson asked Detective Ramos if she had any direct evidence that my father intended to kill me. She said the contingency plan to make me disappear if ransom didn't arrive was documented in Ridge's testimony and Uncle Frank's confession. Nelson pushed. But did she have recordings? Documents? Anything in my father's own words? She said the evidence showed clear intent through the planning, the location choice, and the instructions given to the kidnappers. Sometimes intent was proven through actions, not confessions. Nelson looked frustrated. He sat down. Medical experts came next. Dr. Nakamura, the emergency room doctor who treated me after the crash. Dr. Sharma, the surgeon who repaired my shoulder. Dr. Reynolds, the specialist who monitored my kidney function. Each one brought medical records, x-rays, surgical notes. Dr. Nakamura described my condition when I arrived. Multiple lacerations, severe bruising, dislocated shoulder, 3 fractured ribs, internal bleeding from kidney trauma, possible concussion. She said I was lucky to be alive given the force of impact. The van had rolled multiple times. Most people don't walk away from crashes like that. I didn't walk away either. I crawled. They projected photos from the emergency room onto screens around the courtroom. My face swollen and covered in dried blood. My shoulder sitting wrong, the bone visible under stretched skin. Purple bruises covering my torso. I looked away, but I could see jurors staring. 3 of them looked sick. One woman in the back row had tears in her eyes. Dr. Sharma explained the surgery to repair my shoulder. The joint had been completely dislocated. Ligaments torn. He had to reconstruct the socket using pins and screws. Full recovery would take months. I might never regain complete range of motion. I'd probably have arthritis in that shoulder for the rest of my life. Dr. Reynolds talked about kidney function. The impact had caused significant bruising and internal bleeding. They'd monitored me for signs of permanent damage. I was lucky the kidney healed, but I'd need regular checkups for years to make sure no long-term problems developed. Nelson didn't cross-examine the doctors much. What could he say? The injuries were documented. The photos were real. My father's lawyer couldn't argue away broken bones and surgical scars. Day 4 started with Layla calling my name. I stood up from the gallery and walked to the witness stand. My legs felt steady. I'd practiced this with Philip. Walked through what I'd say, how I'd say it, where I'd look. I put my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. I sat down and focused on Layla's face. Kind eyes, calm expression. I didn't look at my father. Not yet. Couldn't yet. Layla started with easy questions. My name, my age, where I lived, what I did for work. She asked about my relationship with my father before the kidnapping. I said we had dinner together every few weeks. Talked on the phone sometimes. It wasn't close, but it wasn't bad either. Normal divorced family stuff. Then she asked about that morning. I described my usual route through the neighborhood, 6 a.m. because it was cooler. Same path every day because I liked the routine. The white van pulling up beside me. I remembered thinking it was weird that a van was on that residential street so early. Then the door opened. I walked through the fight. Biting, kicking, finding the crowbar, the driver's coffee in his face, grabbing the wheel, the crash, metal folding around us, glass everywhere, my shoulder screaming, crawling out onto the highway, standing there bleeding while cars stopped and people stared. My voice stayed level through all of it. I'd told this story enough times that it felt like reciting facts instead of reliving trauma. Layla asked what happened next. I described the hospital, 3 weeks in intensive care, 2 surgeries, months of physical therapy, learning to use my shoulder again, building back strength in my ribs. She asked about my recovery now. I explained the panic attacks. How I can't jog anymore because every time I try, I'm back in that van. How I check my door locks 5 times before bed. How I sleep with a knife under my pillow even though I know it's irrational. How every white van makes my heart race and my hands shake. How I avoid parking garages and empty streets and anywhere someone could grab me without witnesses. Layla asked when I learned my father was involved. My voice finally cracked. I described Detective Ramos telling me, sitting in that interview room thinking she'd made a mistake, thinking the evidence was wrong, then seeing the bank statements, the phone records, the timeline. I described that dinner 2 weeks before the kidnapping where Dad asked about my jogging route, what time I left, whether I ran alone. I'd thought he cared. I'd thought he was taking an interest. He was planning where to grab me, planning how to get ransom money from my mother, planning what to do with me if the money didn't come. Several jurors were writing notes. I finally looked at my father. He was staring at the table. Wouldn't meet my eyes. Nelson stood up for cross-examination. He asked about my parents' divorce, when it happened, how I felt about it, whether I blamed my father. I said I was sad about the divorce, but I didn't blame anyone. These things happen. Nelson asked if I sided with my mother. I said I maintained relationships with both parents. I had dinner with Dad. I called Mom. I tried to be fair. Nelson suggested I was closer to my mother. I said she lived in California, so we talked on the phone more than I saw Dad in person, but that didn't mean I favored her. Nelson asked about my father's financial situation after the divorce. I said I knew he was struggling, but I didn't know the details. He'd never asked me for money. Never told me how bad things were. Nelson's strategy was obvious. Paint me as the daughter who abandoned her struggling father. Make the jury think I deserved some blame for his desperation. Layla had warned me this would happen. Nelson asked why I hadn't returned to jogging if I was physically healed. I looked directly at him. I said PTSD doesn't care about physical capability. My body can run, but my brain can't handle being outside alone in the early morning. Trauma isn't something you get over because it's convenient. Nelson asked if I was exaggerating my symptoms to make my father look worse. I felt anger flash hot in my chest but kept my voice calm. I said I'd spent 5 months in therapy learning to manage panic attacks. I'd lost my sense of safety. I'd lost the ability to do something I loved. I wasn't exaggerating. I was surviving. Nelson shifted in his chair and leaned forward. He asked if I'd visited my father in jail since his arrest. I said no. He asked if I'd read the letters my father sent from jail. I said I'd read them but hadn't responded. Nelson asked why not, his voice suggesting I was being cruel. I looked directly at him and explained that I didn't owe my would-be murderer emotional support. My father's letters weren't seeking reconciliation. They were asking me to help his defense. They were asking me to testify about his good character so he'd get a lighter sentence. That wasn't reconciliation. That was manipulation. Nelson paused, clearly not expecting that answer. He glanced at his notes. Then he asked his final question. Did I love my father? The courtroom went quiet. He was hoping I'd say no. Hoping I'd seem cold and vindictive. I took a breath and answered honestly. I said I loved who I thought he was. But that person wouldn't have hired men to kidnap me. Wouldn't have planned what to do if ransom didn't come. Wouldn't have asked about my jogging route so he could tell kidnappers where to grab me. So I was grieving someone who apparently never existed. Several jurors nodded. Nelson sat down looking frustrated. Layla stood for redirect. She asked me to explain what I meant about grieving. I said I lost my father twice. Once when I learned what he did. That was the moment I realized the man I trusted had tried to have me killed for money. The second time was when I was accepted he wasn't the person I believed in for 26 years. All those memories of him teaching me to ride a bike, coaching my soccer team, walking me down the aisle at my first communion. Those memories didn't match the man who paid his brother $50,000 to arrange my kidnapping. So I was grieving the father I thought I had while dealing with the reality of who he actually is. My voice stayed steady through all of it. Layla thanked me and told the judge she had no further questions. I stepped down from the witness stand. Walked past my father without looking at him. Sat in the gallery next to the victim advocate. Layla stood and announced the prosecution rests. Nelson immediately stood up. He moved for dismissal, arguing insufficient evidence of intent to harm. He claimed the prosecution hadn't proven my father intended me to be killed, only that he wanted ransom money. The judge didn't even pause to think. She denied the motion within 30 seconds. She said the contingency plan testimony alone established intent. If ransom didn't come, I was supposed to disappear. That wasn't lack of intent. That was premeditated planning for murder. Nelson sat down. The defense case started the next morning. Nelson called character witnesses. My father's former co-workers, his old business partner, a neighbor from before the divorce. They all described my father as a good man before the divorce, a loving father, someone who coached my soccer team and attended every school event, someone who helped neighbors with home repairs, someone who donated to charity. I sat in the gallery and listened to them talk about a version of my father I remembered. The man who taught me to throw a softball, who stayed up late helping me with science projects, who drove me to early morning swim practice without complaining. I watched the jurors' faces. Some were taking notes. Some looked sympathetic. I couldn't tell if this sympathy play was working. If they were thinking maybe he deserved a lighter sentence because he used to be a good person. Nelson called a psychologist who'd evaluated my father. The psychologist testified that my father showed signs of depression and financial stress, that these conditions could impair judgment, that desperate people sometimes make irrational decisions. Layla stood for cross-examination. She asked if depression typically caused people to hire kidnappers. The psychologist admitted it didn't. Layla asked if my father was functional enough to hold down a job during this time. The psychologist said yes. Layla asked if my father was functional enough to plan the crime over several weeks, meeting with Uncle Frank, providing my schedule, arranging payment. The psychologist had to agree he was. Layla asked if someone too impaired to understand their actions could plan something that methodically. The psychologist looked uncomfortable and said probably not. Layla sat down. The defense case continued for 2 more days. More character witnesses, more testimony about how the divorce destroyed my father financially, how my mother got everything in the settlement, how he felt alienated from his children. Nelson was building a narrative of a broken man driven to desperation. But he never put my father on the stand. Layla had predicted this. She'd told me putting him on the stand would let her cross-examine him about the planning details, about the dinner where he asked about my jogging route, about the contingency plan if ransom didn't come, about his lack of remorse. His silence spoke volumes about how weak his defense actually was. Closing arguments took an entire day. Nelson went first. He argued my father made a terrible mistake driven by desperation, that he never intended real harm, that he just wanted money to survive after losing everything in the divorce, that destroying his life with decades in prison served no purpose when he'd already lost his business, his home, his family. That prison wouldn't undo what happened. That mercy was appropriate for a man who'd been a good father for 25 years before one catastrophic error in judgment. Layla's closing came next. She walked the jury through each planning step, asked them if hiring kidnappers sounded like a mistake, if providing my jogging schedule sounded like a mistake, if arranging a remote location sounded like a mistake, if including a contingency plan to make me disappear if ransom didn't come sounded like a mistake. She showed them the bank statements, the phone records, the timeline. She reminded them of Ridge's testimony about the specific instructions, Uncle Frank's testimony about the planning conversations, my testimony about the injuries I suffered. She asked if this sounded like a desperate mistake or premeditated attempted murder. The jury went to deliberate. That was 2 days ago. I've been home trying to distract myself with anything other than imagining what they're discussing. Cade came over yesterday. He reminded me I'd already done the hardest part by testifying, that the outcome was now beyond my control, that I'd told the truth, and that was all I could do. I know he's right, but I can't stop thinking about it, wondering if they believe me, wondering if the character witnesses convinced them my father deserves mercy, wondering if they're debating right now whether hiring kidnappers counts as attempted murder or just really bad judgment. My phone buzzes on Thursday afternoon. Layla's name appears on the screen. I answer on the second ring. She tells me the jury reached a verdict. They want us at the courthouse in an hour. I drive there on autopilot, my hands steady on the wheel even though my stomach churns. Layla meets me outside the courtroom. She says nothing about what the verdict might be. We walk inside together. The courtroom fills quickly. My mother sits 3 rows back. I don't see Derek anywhere. My father sits at the defense table beside Nelson, his shoulders hunched forward. He doesn't look at me when I enter. The bailiff calls the court to order. The judge enters. Everyone stands. We sit again. The jury files in through the side door, 12 faces I've studied for days, trying to read their thoughts. None of them look at my father. Layla told me that's usually a bad sign for the defense. The foreperson hands a folded paper to the bailiff. The bailiff hands it to the judge. The judge unfolds it, reads it silently, folds it again. She asks my father to stand. He stands. Nelson stands beside him. The judge asks the foreperson if the jury has reached a verdict. The foreperson says they have. The judge asks them to read it. Guilty on count 1, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Guilty on count 2, attempted murder. Guilty on count 3, solicitation of murder. I finally look directly at my father. Tears run down his face. His mouth moves, but no sound comes out. Nelson puts a hand on his shoulder. My father turns to look at me across the courtroom. I feel nothing except relief that 12 strangers believed me. He wanted me to see him as the victim of circumstances, the desperate man driven to bad choices. The jury saw him as what he actually is. Someone who planned to have his daughter kidnapped and possibly killed for money. The judge thanks the jury for their service. She sets sentencing for 3 weeks from today. The bailiff leads my father out through the side door. He looks back once more before disappearing. I don't look away this time. I watch him leave. Layla walks me out of the courtroom. She says I did everything right. She says the verdict was just. She reminds me that sentencing is when I'll read my victim impact statement, when I'll have the chance to tell him directly what he did to my life. She asks if I've started writing it. I tell her I've drafted something, but it doesn't feel complete yet. She says I have 3 weeks to get it right. My mother hugs me in the hallway. She's crying. She says she's proud of me. She says justice was served. She asks if I want to get dinner. I tell her I need to be alone tonight. She understands. She kisses my forehead and leaves. I drive home and sit at my kitchen table with my laptop open. The victim impact statement stares back at me, half finished. I've been working on it for weeks, but keep deleting paragraphs, rewriting sections, trying to find words that capture everything his choices destroyed. How do you explain what it feels like to discover the person who was supposed to protect you tried to have you killed? How do you describe panic attacks that hit without warning, nightmares that won't stop, the way every white van makes your heart race? I write for 3 hours that night. Delete most of it. Start again. I want the judge to understand the full scope of the damage, not just the physical injuries that healed, the psychological wounds that haven't, the way I check my locks 5 times before bed, the way I can't jog anymore without my chest tightening, the way I flinch when someone approaches me from behind, the way I sleep with a knife under my pillow because part of me still believes someone might come for me in the dark. By the end of the week, I have a draft I can live with. 3 pages, single-spaced, every panic attack documented, every nightmare described, every moment I've felt unsafe in my own life because the person who was supposed to protect me hired men to grab me off the street. I read it aloud to myself. My voice shakes on certain paragraphs. That's okay. I want him to see what his choices did. Kate and I meet the following Tuesday. He asks how I'm handling the verdict. I tell him I feel relieved but also empty, like I've been holding my breath for months and finally exhaled but don't know what to do with the air in my lungs now. He says that's normal. He says the trial gave me a focus, something concrete to prepare for, and now that it's over, I have to figure out what comes next. I ask him what comes next. He says that's what we'll work on together. The 3 weeks pass slowly. I revise the statement twice more. Read it to my mother over the phone. She cries through most of it. She says it's powerful. She says the judge will understand. I hope she's right. Sentencing day arrives on a cold morning in late November. I wear the same outfit I wore for trial testimony. Simple black pants, white blouse, nothing flashy. I want the judge to focus on my words, not my appearance. Layla meets me outside the courthouse again. She walks me through what will happen. The defense will present mitigating factors. Character witnesses might speak. Then I'll read my statement. Then the judge will issue the sentence. She warns me that Nelson will probably ask for leniency, will paint my father as a broken man who made one terrible mistake. She reminds me not to react visibly. Let the statement speak for itself. The courtroom fills. My mother sits in the same spot as before. Derek is here this time, sitting on the opposite side of the room. He doesn't acknowledge me when I enter. My father sits at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. His hair is grayer than it was 3 weeks ago. He looks smaller somehow. The judge enters. We stand. We sit. Nelson goes first. He presents letters from my father's former co-workers describing him as reliable and kind. A former neighbor talks about how my father helped him repair his fence after a storm. My father's sister testifies that the divorce destroyed him emotionally and financially. Nelson argues that 20 years of being a good father should count for something. That one catastrophic error in judgment shouldn't define an entire life. That prison won't undo what happened. That mercy is appropriate. Layla responds briefly. She says character is revealed in crisis, and my father's crisis response was to hire men to kidnap his daughter. She says good deeds in the past don't erase attempted murder in the present. She says the judge should consider the premeditation, the planning, the complete betrayal of trust. Then it's my turn. I walk to the podium. My hands shake as I unfold the statement. I look directly at my father. He's crying again. I start reading. I describe the morning of the kidnapping, the van pulling up beside me, the hands yanking me inside, fighting for my life against 3 men, the crash, crawling out onto the highway with a dislocated shoulder and cracked ribs, 3 weeks in the hospital, 2 surgeries, months of physical therapy. The detective telling me my own father arranged it, not believing it at first. Then seeing the bank statements, the phone records, the evidence, realizing he'd asked about my jogging route over dinner 2 weeks before, understanding that he'd been planning where to grab me. I described the panic attacks. The first one hit in a grocery store parking lot when I saw a white van. My chest tightened. My vision blurred. I couldn't breathe. Someone called an ambulance. The paramedics found nothing physically wrong. It was just my body remembering what happened in a van like that one. It happens regularly now. In parking lots. On highways. Anywhere I see white vans or feel trapped. I describe the nightmares. I'm back in that van almost every night. Fighting men who want to take me somewhere remote. Knowing that if I don't fight hard enough, I'll disappear. I wake up gasping, covered in sweat, reaching for the knife under my pillow. I can't sleep without it there. I need to know I have a way to defend myself if someone comes for me in the dark. I describe how I can't jog anymore. I tried once, 3 months after the kidnapping. Made it 2 blocks before the panic attack hit. My therapist says it might always be that way. The activity is too connected to the trauma. Every time I try to run, my body thinks I'm in danger. So I lost something I loved because my father decided my life was worth less than $50,000. I look up from the statement. My father is sobbing now, his face in his hands. I keep reading. I tell him that I don't forgive him. That forgiveness isn't something he's entitled to just because we share DNA. That being my father gave him responsibilities, not rights. His responsibility was to protect me. Instead, he hired men to grab me off the street. His responsibility was to keep me safe. Instead, he created a plan where I'd disappear if the ransom didn't come. His responsibility was to love me. Instead, he valued money more than my life. I tell him that I hope his time in prison gives him clarity about the magnitude of what he destroyed. Not just my sense of safety, my ability to trust people, my relationship with my brother, who thinks I should have protected him from consequences, my relationship with my mother, who spent years afraid to warn me about him, my ability to do simple things like jog or park in certain lots or sleep without a weapon nearby. He destroyed all of that because he wanted money and thought my life was an acceptable price to pay for it. I fold the statement. Look at him one more time. Tell him I hope he understands now that some things can't be undone. That hiring men to kidnap your daughter isn't a mistake you apologize away. That the person sitting in this courtroom today isn't the daughter who had dinner with him 2 weeks before the kidnapping. That girl is gone. He killed her when he decided her life was worth less than his bank account. I walk back to my seat. My hands have stopped shaking. Layla squeezes my shoulder as I sit down. The judge speaks. She says she's reviewed all the evidence, heard all the testimony, considered the arguments from both sides. She says this case involves a level of betrayal that defies comprehension. A parent's fundamental duty is to protect their child. My father didn't just fail in that duty. He actively worked to harm me. He planned the kidnapping over weeks. He provided my schedule. He arranged the location. He approved a contingency plan that would have resulted in my death if the ransom didn't come. She says the injuries I suffered were severe. Dislocated shoulder, cracked ribs, bruised kidney, weeks in the hospital, months of recovery. But the psychological damage is arguably worse. Complex PTSD, panic attacks, inability to engage in activities I once enjoyed, constant hypervigilance, sleep disruption, a fundamental loss of trust in the people who should be trustworthy. She says the premeditation is an aggravating factor. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was calculated, planned, executed with full knowledge of the potential consequences. My father had multiple opportunities to stop, to change his mind, to choose a different path. He chose this one at every decision point. She says the betrayal of the parent-child relationship is another aggravating factor. Society depends on parents protecting children. When that fundamental bond is violated, when a parent becomes the source of harm rather than protection, the damage extends beyond the individual victim. It undermines trust in family structures themselves. She sentences him to 22 years in prison with possibility of parole after 15 years. My father collapses forward onto the table. Nelson steadies him. The bailiff approaches. My father stands slowly, his hands behind his back for the handcuffs. He looks at me one final time before they lead him toward the side door. I don't look away. I watch him leave. Watch the door close behind him. Something lifts from my chest. a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. The trial is over. He's been held accountable. I can finally start building a life without looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'll face consequences. The consequences came. 22 years, possibly 15 with parole. Either way, I'll be in my 40s before he's eligible for release. That feels like enough time to build something new. Layla walks me out. She says the sentence was appropriate given the circumstances. She says I should be proud of how I handled everything. She reminds me that if the surviving kidnapper who fled ever gets caught, she'll need me to testify again. I tell her I'll be ready if that happens. My mother meets me in the hallway. She hugs me, tells me it's over now, tells me I can start healing. I want to believe her. Derek sends an email that night. Short. 3 sentences. He attended sentencing. He thinks the sentence was too harsh. He hopes I find peace. I stare at the email for 10 minutes. Consider responding. Decide there's nothing left to say to someone who watched our father get convicted of trying to kill me and still thinks I'm the problem. I delete the email without replying. My mother calls a week later, asks if I want to have dinner. We meet at a quiet restaurant downtown. She orders wine. I order water. We sit across from each other in a booth by the window. She tells me she was wrong. Wrong to push for forgiveness before I was ready. Wrong to suggest I could testify about his good qualities while being honest about what happened. Wrong to prioritize family unity over my safety and healing. She says watching me testify made her realize how much courage it took to face him. How much strength it required to stand firm against everyone who wanted me to minimize what happened. She says she's proud of me. Says she should have said that months ago. I tell her I appreciate that. Tell her I know it wasn't easy for her either. Watching the father of her children get convicted of trying to kill their daughter. Dealing with Derek's anger. Navigating her own guilt about not warning me sooner. She starts crying. Says she should have told me years ago that she was afraid of him. That she saw signs during the marriage. That she tried to protect me by getting the divorce but worried telling me the truth would make me hate her. I reach across the table. Hold her hand. Tell her we're both doing the best we can with an impossible situation. Tell her I don't blame her for his choices. Tell her I'm glad she's here now. We finish dinner. She drives me home, hugs me in my driveway, tells me to call her anytime. I promise I will. Kate and I meet 2 days later. He asks how I'm processing everything now that the trial is finished. I tell him I feel relieved but also uncertain. Like I spent months focused on this one goal, and now that it's achieved, I don't know what comes next. He says that's normal. Says trauma recovery isn't linear. That I might feel relief now, but still have hard days. That healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry the experience without it controlling me. He asks what I want my life to look like now. I tell him I'm not sure. I want to jog again eventually. Want to sleep without a weapon nearby. Want to the park in any lot without checking for white vans first. Want to feel safe in my own life. He says those are good goals. Says we'll work toward them together. Says progress might be slow, but it will come. 3 months pass. Winter turns to early spring. I start going to the gym. Use the indoor track. Short sessions at first. Quarter mile, then half. The panic doesn't come immediately like it did before. My therapist says that's progress. I'm reclaiming the activity slowly, teaching my body that running doesn't mean danger. One Tuesday morning in March, I complete a full mile without stopping, without the chest tightness, without the fear. I stand on the track afterward, breathing hard, and something breaks loose inside me. I walk to the locker room, sit on the bench, cry into my hands, not from sadness, from reclaiming something he tried to take from me. Running was mine before it became connected to the worst day of my life. Now it's starting to be mine again. I get a call from Layla 3 weeks after I complete my first full mile. She tells me they caught him, the man who ran from the crash site. He got picked up in Nevada on a drug charge, and when they ran his DNA through the system, it matched blood evidence from inside the van. He's being held without bail, and they're starting extradition proceedings to bring him back here for trial. She asks if I'm willing to testify again. I don't hesitate. Yes, I tell her. Whatever you need. She says she'll keep me updated on the timeline, and we hang up. I sit in my apartment afterward, staring at my phone. Part of me thought he'd gotten away forever, that he'd just vanish and never face what he did. But they found him. The system worked this time. I start looking for a new place to live 2 days later. My current apartment has thin walls and a parking lot where anyone can walk up to my door. I need something different. Something that feels safer. I tour 5 places before I find the right one. Second floor with controlled access. Big windows that let in natural light. A deadbolt and a chain lock and a security system I can monitor from my phone. The landlord runs my background check and approves me within a week. I sign the lease standing in the empty living room, looking out those windows at the street below. This space is mine. I get to decide how to arrange the furniture, what color to paint the walls, whether to hang curtains or leave the windows bare. Every choice I make here is mine, not shaped by what he did or who he wanted me to be. Moving day comes and I pack everything I own into boxes. My friend Sarah helps me load the truck. We carry furniture up the stairs, arrange my bed and dresser and bookshelf in the new bedroom. I hang pictures on the walls, put dishes in the cabinets, set up my coffee maker on the kitchen counter. By evening, the apartment looks like home. Sarah orders pizza and we eat sitting on my couch, and I realize I feel something I haven't felt in months. Safe. Not completely, not without the knife I still keep in my nightstand drawer, but safer than before. A letter arrives from Uncle Frank 6 weeks after I move. I recognize the prison return address before I open it. Inside is a single page written in his handwriting. He says he's sorry. Says he thinks about what he did every single day. Says he knows there's nothing he can do to make it right, but he needed me to know that he carries the weight of his choices. The letter doesn't ask for anything. Doesn't suggest I visit or write back or forgive him. It just sits there on the page, this acknowledgement of what he did to me. I read it 3 times. Then I sit down at my kitchen table with a pen and paper. I write back. 2 paragraphs. I tell him I received his letter and I acknowledge his apology. I tell him I'm glad he's taking responsibility for his actions. Then I tell him we will never have a relationship again. That I needed him to know I got his letter, but this is the only communication we'll ever have. I seal the envelope and mail it the next morning. It feels like closing a door I didn't realize was still open. I see a flyer at my therapist's office in August. A victims' rights organization looking for volunteers to help people navigate the criminal justice system. I take a picture of it with my phone. That night, I visit their website and fill out an application. They call me a week later for an interview. I sit across from the program director in a small office downtown and explain what happened to me. The kidnapping, the trial, the testimony. She listens without interrupting, then tells me they'd be honored to have me join their team. I start training in September. Learn how to help people file victim impact statements, understand court procedures, prepare for testimony. By October, I'm paired with my first case. A woman whose ex-boyfriend assaulted her and she's terrified of seeing him in court. I meet her at a coffee shop and walk her through what will happen, where she'll sit, what questions the lawyers will ask, how to stay calm if she feels overwhelmed. 2 weeks later, she testifies, and afterward she hugs me in the courthouse hallway and thanks me for making her feel less alone. I drive home that day feeling something shift inside me. The trauma isn't gone. It never will be. But I'm using it to help people who are where I was. That transforms it into something with purpose instead of just pain. A year passes. The anniversary of the trial comes and goes. I'm working full-time now at a marketing firm, a job I found 3 months after everything ended. My coworkers don't know about the kidnapping unless I choose to tell them, which I usually don't. I have friends who invite me to dinner and weekend trips. I still see Cade every 2 weeks, and we've moved from crisis management to maintenance. The panic attacks still come, but less often. Maybe once a month instead of once a week. I've learned to recognize the warning signs and use the grounding techniques he taught me. My apartment feels like home now, not just a safe place to hide. I've started cooking real meals instead of surviving on takeout. I bought plants for the windowsills and they're actually still alive. I go to the gym 4 times a week and run on the indoor track without my chest tightening. Small things that add up to a life that feels like mine. Not the life I had before the kidnapping, because that person doesn't exist anymore. But a life I've built deliberately, with intention, from the pieces of who I am now. I register for a 5K race in early spring. The date is March 18th, exactly 2 years after the kidnapping. I could let that day pass quietly, pretend it's just another Tuesday. But I don't want to give him that power anymore. I want to mark it with something that proves I'm still here, still strong, still moving forward. Training is hard at first. I can run a mile easily now, but 3.1 miles is different. My legs burn. My lungs ache. But I keep showing up at the gym, adding distance slowly, building endurance. Race day arrives cold and clear. I stand at the starting line surrounded by hundreds of other runners, and for the first time in 2 years, I'm outside running and I'm not afraid. The gun goes off and we surge forward. I settle into a steady pace, focusing on my breathing and the rhythm of my feet hitting pavement. My legs feel strong. My mind stays clear. I pass the first mile marker, then the second. At mile 3, my muscles are screaming, but I push through. The finish line appears ahead and I sprint the last 100 yards, crossing it with my arms raised. The clock says 32 minutes and 18 seconds. Not fast by competitive standards, but I don't care about speed. I care that I did it. That I chose to spend this anniversary running instead of hiding. That he tried to break me and I'm here, whole, finishing a race 2 years later. Proof that I survived him. Proof that I'm thriving in spite of everything he did. My mother and I talk on the phone every Sunday now. Real conversations where we're honest instead of careful. She started therapy 6 months ago, working through her guilt about not protecting me from Dad sooner. She's admitted things she couldn't say before. How he scared her during the marriage. How she knew he was capable of violence, but hoped getting away from him would be enough. How she's carried the weight of wondering if she should have warned me more explicitly, even if it meant I'd hate her for saying bad things about my father. I've told her I don't blame her for his choices. That he's the one who decided to hire kidnappers, not her. That she did protect me by leaving him, even if she couldn't predict what he'd do years later. We're learning to support each other without minimizing what happened or rushing toward forgiveness before either of us is ready. She flew out for the 5K race, stood at the finish line with a sign that said, "Proud of you," in big letters. We went to brunch afterward and she cried happy tears while I ate pancakes. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's real now, built on truth instead of avoidance. I realized sometime in late spring that I don't think about my father every day anymore. There are stretches, 3 or 4 days sometimes, where he doesn't cross my mind at all. Then a week passes and I notice the absence. That I went 7 full days without remembering his face or his voice or what he did. The space he used to occupy in my thoughts has shrunk to almost nothing. When I do think about him, it's factual rather than emotional. He's in prison. He'll be there for years. That's just reality now, not something that consumes me. The freedom in that absence is huge. Like I've finally reclaimed my life from his shadow. I survived the worst thing I could imagine. I faced him in court and testified and watched him get convicted. I rebuilt myself into someone stronger than the person I was before. And now I'm just living. Going to work, seeing friends, running races, helping other victims find their voices. That's the best revenge. Not hatred or anger or obsession with what he did. Just living well, on my terms, in a life he has no part of. He tried to destroy me and he failed. I'm still here. And that's everything.